It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Siobhan Bailey, Labour MP Angela Eagle, Chief Feature Writer of the Northern Echo Chris Lloyd, political consultant and former advisor to Boris Johnson Git O'Harry. Today, who's right when it comes to social care?
It's necessary, it's fair, it's responsible, it provides the limit to the cost of care for everyone in the adult social care system for the first time.
It's not levelling up, it's frankly daylight robbery.
Labour claims it is now the pro-business party.
Forgive me. Forgive me.
When the Prime Minister did find his place, this was his message.
I've never been anything other than business's #1 fan.
Across Europe, protests against COVID restrictions turn violent.
Boom, 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 like that. Yeah.
It's been a bruising few weeks for Boris Johnson, but is he really on the ropes? Let's go back to the story you saw briefly in the headlines about protests, some of them peaceful, some of them violent, across cities in Europe as governments respond to a new surge of COVID cases with new restrictions. Let's first of all show you these pictures from Vienna, Austria's capital. Tens of thousands marching after the government announced a new national lockdown and plans to make jabs compulsory in February. It'd be the first European country to do this. Similar numbers of protesters gathered here in Brussels, where Belgian police, as you can see, used water cannon in response, as well as tear gas after some people threw stones and were hurling fireworks at officers. Now, more violent here in the Netherlands, in The Hague, the capital, where hooded rioters set fire to bicycles. Rotterdam and Groningen also saw unrest. There is a lockdown now ongoing in the Netherlands after recording a record spike in COVID cases. Let's just show you some of the numbers. You can see here on this graph, case rates rising sharply in parts of Europe is the title, Austria there and the Netherlands. If you look at the UK, it has been, this expression, sort of running hot with relatively high cases since really the summertime, and people may be wondering whether there should be an added response from the UK government to that. Well, let's listen to Professor Andrew Pollard, director of the Oxford Vaccine Group, on his reaction yesterday.
If we look at what's happening in other countries at the moment, they're just experiencing the start of another wave of spread of infection. And the reason why the virus spreads is a combination of changes in social distancing, whether that's lockdown measures or mask wearing, plus the immunity in the population. We've actually had some spread going on since the summer. And so I think it's unlikely that we're going to see the very sharp rise in the next few months that's just been seen.
In a sense, we're ahead of that.
We're already ahead of that.
All right, Professor Andrew Pollard there. My question to all of you, starting with you, Siobhan, is can the UK continue to buck the trend of reintroducing tougher restrictions or any kind of lockdown?
Oh, we can never be complacent about COVID. We've seen that every time we think we're settled, something will change. But I think this country has prepared for winter. We knew winter was going to be tricky. We've invested, billions and billions of pounds into the health service, and we've really focused on vaccines. We're ahead of the curve for many of the countries on vaccines, and a real focus on the boosters now. What we do know, looking at some of those awful scenes across Europe, is there's no appetite in the country for more lockdowns, and I think the government is balancing all sorts of difficult scenarios, but they are really focused on health, really focused on protecting the NHS and looking after the country.
Do you agree, Angela?
Well, I think we've been having 40,000 infections a day. We've been having about 1,000, there or about, deaths a week. Since the middle of summer. I think 15,000 people have died since so-called Freedom Day.
So I would want to see more restrictions?
Well, only if the figures demonstrate that we have to do that. But I would have wanted to see the vaccination of children go much faster and start earlier. I also think the booster programme has been slow to take off, and we need to put much more effort into getting people their boosters and also teenagers their second shots, so that we can get as much protection as possible. In some circumstances, obviously, we also need to ensure that mask wearing is perhaps re-mandated. We'll just have to see. But it's important that we're prepared to take those kinds of precautions so that we can try and stop that huge takeoff that we've seen in Europe.
Gito, I mean, responding to what Angela has just said, not good enough in certain areas, vaccinating children and the booster programme. Or do you think that because we haven't seen the sorts of protests that we've witnessed in parts of Europe, that it's a vindication in part of the government strategy?
I think we're moving to a world where people are acknowledging that COVID is not the only killer. You know, not many winters ago, 28,000 people died of flu, and it's tragic, and we need to do everything we can to stop that. But we should stop thinking that we shut down the economy, we close things down, we prevent normal life and the creation of wealth and all that from going ahead. Because if we do that, there'll be other killers that will just sneak up on us. So we have got to learn to live with COVID, do what is prudent, but not overreact and have this instinct to control everything and shut things down every time infections go up. The really good news is that though infections go up, deaths are not rising as they used to. People are surviving it. People are sick for a few days. It's unpleasant, but it's not a killer. It's something we have to live with.
Chris, what about you? Has the government got the balance right or not?
Well, just about. I don't like the idea of creating a two-tier society between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. We're supposed to be levelling up, not breaking things down. So I'm very hopeful that we can kind of not go down the same path as Europe. But I don't understand the antipathy to mask wearing. There was a survey last week that showed that it cuts infections by 53%. It's more effective than hand washing or social distancing. And yet the message from our superiors is that that we should not really be adopting it in closed spaces, and I think there are measures that we can take to make ourselves even safer than we are. Right,
before we move on, just a reminder, this story in BBC News, over 40s in England can book their boosters from today. So if you haven't done so, you can do so now, and those phone lines will be open. Let's have a look at this headline in the HuffPost. Boris Johnson faces Tory rebellion over social care costs. Now, MPs are going to be voting later today on the government's plan for how a new cap on social care costs would work, and that's the cap of £86,000 per person for care payments. Let's talk to Ben Wright, the BBC's political correspondent. First of all, what exactly are MPs going to be voting on?
They're voting, Jo, to change the law in a way that would allow the government to adjust the way that this new cap will be calculated. So you'll remember back in September, the government announced that it was going to totally overhaul the way that social care in England is funded, bringing in for the first time a cap on an individual's care costs, £86,000. But what ministers announced last week is that they were going to remove means testing support from the way that that cap is calculated. And to bring that change in, they need to change the law. And that's what's going to happen today. Report stage of a bill that's already going through Parliament. MPs will vote in the Commons before that piece of legislation goes off to the Lords. So whatever happens later, it's not the end of the story, but it's an important moment for MPs to have their say. And as you said, Jo, some Conservative MPs are quite concerned about the ramifications of this particular technical change to the way the cap is calculated, because they think in the end what it's going to do is completely protect wealthy pensioners who have high care costs in the south of England and entirely protect their assets. Whereas for people who don't have that sort of wealth, who do have high care costs in parts of England where their assets are about £100,000, this will not be as generous as originally thought, and that's why there's some Tory unease. Right, some Tory unease. I mean, how deep is the strength of feeling on this in terms of Conservatives rebelling later? Well, I think they're concerned for a number of reasons. I think there is some concern among Tories about how this was actually handled and announced last week. It was done on the same day that there was the big rail announcement, which of course threw the Tories and the government's levelling up agenda and its policies for the north of England into sharp relief. And this change was announced on the same day. I think there is disquiet about how this plays into the levelling up agenda. And I think there is the impact this will have on, poorer voters in the Midlands and the north of England who don't have big expensive houses, who may be voting Conservative for the first time. There's the sort of the practical implication and impact on them that I think a lot of Tories are concerned about. But in terms of numbers, it's not going to make any difference tonight. The Health and Social Care Select Committee Chair, Jeremy Hunt, was saying this morning, even though he doesn't think this change is as progressive as it should be, he, for one, and he's an important voice, is urging his fellow Conservatives to back this in the Commons and then try and change it perhaps later on when it goes to the House of Lords.
Ben Wright, thank you very much. Siobhan, on that issue of whether it's progressive or not, I mean, the Prime Minister has said today, I think, in response to questions, that the cap is very, very progressive. But the architect of the cap and of this system, Andrew Dilnot, who carried out the original review, over 10 years ago, has said precisely the opposite, that the least well-off will pay far more proportionately.
Well, before I come to Andrew Dilnot, which I will do, the thing that comes up on the doorsteps about social care is will I have to sell my home? Will I lose my home to cover social care costs? And the bill, as it says, and I do want to say to anybody watching, the bill does protect the ability to stay in your home. It provides a deferral payment. It provides protection for a spouse. That is really, really important because that's something people are genuinely worried about. I had a gentleman in my constituency surgery on Friday about this. With the Andrew Dilnot concerns that he's been raising, I am one of those Conservative MPs that is concerned about this and asking more questions. I'm not out yet. I've not decided how I will vote, but I think it is really important that we think very carefully about the impact on different people and different groups of people. But ultimately, the cap is a really important thing to have in place, and we've also quadrupled the floor to make sure that there's so many other protections. So I think all of the Conservative MPs, all of the MPs in the House, regardless of the party, will be looking at this bill in the round.
What are your specific concerns?
Well, concerns in relation to exactly what Andrew Dilnot was talking about, people who have only £100,000 worth of assets, will they be penalised from any change of the proposal?
Well, he says they will be £186,000, but he says they will be penalised.
But I think there's also mitigations being proposed, so we've got to have a look at this bill in completion. And one thing with Andrew Dilnot, he did say, he's very, very clear that this bill should be to the government's credit. I mean, governments from all different parties have dodged this question.
Angela?
Well, we're not talking about the bill at the moment. We're actually talking about a sneaky change to a National Health Service bill which will impose this cap, and effectively that will create an inheritance tax on people who have assets worth 186,000 or below. People who have much bigger, more valuable houses, say you had a house that was worth $1 million, you'd pay a maximum of you'd keep 90% of your assets with the £86,000 cap. If your house was worth 70,000, you'd lose the lot. So this is actually an inheritance tax which penalises those who have lower value assets, houses that are worth less, and 67% of them are in the northwest, the northeast, or Yorkshire and Humber. So it's actually a tax on the north.
I think, as I said, one of the most important things is about being able to stay in home. And I do want to say to Labour, just be very, very careful with the politicking on this and the labels like inheritance tax and the dementia tax. We saw in 2017 when there were some solid proposals being put forward, but by the time the drama and all the politics had fallen through, they were thrown out, baby out with the bathwater, and now years down the line and nothing's happened.
Boris
I think it is very important.
In his manifesto, this is another broken promise. He promised that no one would have to lose their houses to pay for the costs of social care. They've just now.
Well, Siobhan is saying they won't have to in their lifetime.
Well, we haven't seen the bill. I mean, this is just a change which imposes that inheritance tax mainly on the north and protects richer people rather than those with poorer, lower levels of assets. That is effectively what this sneaky little change that came out last week did. And Andrew Dilnot, the architect of the social care reforms, actually was very, very clear that this was not fair and it would penalise those who are poorer more when he gave evidence to the Treasury Select Committee last week.
All right, we'll dig into some of the sums a little more in a moment. But, Chris, your reaction to it so far and probably from your readers?
Yes, I think it is demonstrably unfair, really. In Bishop Auckland, one of the Red Wall constituencies just up the road from here, its average house prices are 120,000. Darlington, the average house price, I believe, is 135,000. Whereas in London, the average is about 650,000. And yet they're all going to keep the same sort of level, the £86,000. And that just doesn't seem fair. But whether or not our MPs are going to really rebel on this, I don't know, because they're hoping that they will get some credit for tackling what is an issue that really needs to be tackled.
Right, and that point, Gitto, the government will no doubt maintain that it is grappling something that has dogged successive governments. But is there a danger that what Angela calls a sneaky little change, which does look to actually sort of break that link between people who are means-tested for support for social care, won't be able to have some of that support count towards the overall cap? Will that, in the end, politically damage what the government is trying to do?
Of course, there's a danger, and it's good that people are reflecting on this and possibly going to tweak it. But in the end, as you imply, the object of the exercise here is make sure that social care is properly funded, and that most of us can grow old without the fear of not having somewhere where we can go where we are looked after. So how you fund that is never going to be a free hit for anyone. Somebody somewhere is going to resent paying an extra price. It sounds on this occasion
But should
like
it be those who are less well off?
No, it sounds on this occasion like the wrong people are picking up too heavy a burden. Though there are, of course, those who have £1 million houses pay a big thing called inheritance tax on a big chunk of that million. So that money is recouped another way. So to look at it in too isolated a way doesn't give the whole picture of how you share the burden of funding all kinds of things that the state is there to provide for. But at last, somebody's trying to grapple with social care and provide something we can all have confidence in.
Do you accept that, Angela?
Well, if you're going to have an inheritance tax, a wealth tax, then you shouldn't be making the burden of it tie into those who've got lower levels of assets rather than higher levels.
Is it important, though, to grapple the issue and to proceed with it if it can be changed and tweaked along the way?
Well, we have to look to see what the social care bill, which hasn't been published yet, actually says. But what they've done here is use the NHS bill, which is going through now, to make a change to the law to establish an unfair principle to begin with. Now, why do it that way round? Why not actually wait until you've got the social care bill, you've had the white paper and you're looking at the thing as a whole, rather than actually do your savings before we've got the rest of the care plans? That makes me immediately suspicious.
We've seen the government is really looking at this. We've had the £36 billion fund
for the recovery, for the post-pandemic fund. So well, and of course, there are questions about when that will go to.
And I think we know Labour hasn't got a plan for social care. We've said that we've got. It must be really important that we look at all of these issues and we look at them in the round. As I've said, I am somebody that's concerned about this, and I will look at it carefully.
And are you minded to vote against it then if it isn't changed?
I'm not sure. I mean, I have indicated that I wouldn't be opposed to voting against. So, we've got to think about. I mean, people like Jeremy Hunt, people that are really sort of in the weeds of this. The former Health Secretary Matt Hancock. We've got to listen to all of those voices that have been in detail to really consider.
It seems that Jeremy Hunt wants not to vote against it himself, but he wants the Lords to overturn it. So, OK.
Well, let's sort of move away from what might happen in Parliament to what Labour's policy is, because you were saying we have got a policy on social care. Broadly, tell us what it is. You agree with a cap of some sort, presumably, in terms of the amount of cost someone will spend over a lifetime.
At the last election, we were talking about having a health and social care system and looking at social insurance for all of that. And we also have to have a strategy for getting the right number of care workers, doing much more preventative work so people can stay in their homes for longer. There's a range of things that you have to do to make sure that this system, which has been neglected for too long, is actually much more preventative and more robust and allows families to ensure that their loved ones are looked after without these catastrophic costs.
Right. I mean, Chris, is there a perfect system, though? When Angela talks about a range of things to make it fairer, of course, that's what everybody wants, whatever that looks like.
But the one thing that I've heard that might make it fairer is, rather than having a flat rate cap of 86,000, is whether you actually look at percentage of someone's house price, and if people have give up 50% of the property, for example, whether that would be fairer.
Right. I mean, Gitto, do you think that's the sort of thing that people look at? Because this issue, not only has it dogged governments, but to some extent with Theresa May, well, not to some extent, to every extent, you know, it lost that majority.
It's a nightmare, and I'm not qualified to start making detailed policy on the hoof. There's an issue of principle here that, you know, certain Conservative backbenchers are right to sort of address and question and try to refine it. But it is one of those things that has got to be kicked into shape in Parliament. But at least there's an opportunity now to do that, and we can look at the future of social healthcare, knowing that for the first time in decades that somebody is try to put in place a system that we can all have confidence in, that is properly funded, that provides for the work and the spaces that we need to grow old without worrying too much.
Let's talk about business. Front page of City AM. Keir Starmer makes his pitch to the City. It's the Confederation of British Industry 3-day annual conference. It's in various locations. Earlier this morning we heard from Boris Johnson, and Sir Keir Starmer is due to speak later today. Let's talk to Andy Sylvester, editor of City AM. We've just read your headline there. Andy, does business feel unloved by political parties these days?
Afternoon. It certainly doesn't feel like the most popular boy or girl in school at the minute. It does seem that particularly the government is not necessarily ignorant, but certainly has put the concerns of business quite a way down the agenda. There's a lot of talk about the economic recovery, but at the same time, you've got all sorts of burdens hitting small, medium and large businesses, be it supply chain crisis, be that higher taxes. And frankly, it's fertile ground for Labour, and that's what Keir Starmer is trying to do. Today, it's a pretty decisive break from the Corbyn era. The very fact he was writing in City AM is a decisive break in and of itself. But he said, when businesses profit, we all do. And, you know, that is territory that they can take forward. It's worth noting, Labour's policy documents so far have been pretty lacking in answers to the questions that business are asking, but then that's the benefit of opposition. And if they can keep hammering the government, I think you may find more business leaders listening than was perhaps the case even 6 to 12 months ago.
Right. Do you think it is a vote winner being on the side of business?
Who knows if it's a vote winner, but it's certainly not a vote loser to be on the side of business. And I think a lot of people, especially around here in the Square Mile, who I think it's fair to say have traditionally looked towards the Conservative Party as the party of business, have just been surprised, really, that over the past sort of 3 to 4 years, a bit of post-Brexit hangover, perhaps, but certainly post-pandemic in the last 12 months, that there just hasn't been as much discussion about immigration, supply chains, and so on, and just not enough sort of, I guess, massaging the ego of business, to be completely frank. It is, after all, the sector that produces the jobs that Boris Johnson seems to want. There is an appreciation that during the pandemic, government did step up for business. There's an appreciation, I think, that number 11 in particular, the Chancellor, gets the concerns of business.
All right.
But I want to see more.
All right, Andy Sylvester, thank you very much. Picking up on that, Gitto, business wants to have its ego massaged. I'm sure it does. Is it, though, electorally an advantage for the political parties to do so still?
Well, it's got to be a no-brainer, isn't it, in the end, because businesses do produce the jobs and opportunities that most people rely on, and they produce the tax revenues that other people rely on to fund public services. So if you're not sort of looking after business, then you're negligent of your role in government. So there is a case that this government could do a bit more, could be a little bit more ostentatious in being open and sympathetic.
Or has it done the exact opposite, as some in business feel?
Well, we know of a couple of phrases used, unfortunately, over the years. But I think when the Prime Minister says, you know my instincts, I think people also know where his instincts are. And the Labour Party, for better or worse, historically, has, other than when the Blairites were in power and you were a minister, where Peter Mandelson said, we're very relaxed about people being filthy rich. Can't imagine a Conservative saying that, certainly not the current Conservative Party. But that was the last Labour government. So, yes, Keir Starmer's right to go after them, but most people in business still know that in the end, the instincts of most people who are in the Labour Party is to tax more heavily, to regulate more aggressively, and to sort of see business as something that is inherently grubby and wrong in the end. And nobody can make a lot of money without it somehow involving having something slightly...
Is that your view of business, Angela?
No, I mean, it's a ridiculous caricature. If you think about Harold Wilson and his wife...
That's a long time ago now.
Technology, if you think
we've
about
had Jeremy
Blair,
Corbyn and we've had Ed Miliband, and, you know, there's been a lot of, you know...
Have you quite finished? I think that no economy can prosper and no country can give its people prosperity without business and society working together, and the governments have to ensure that they create a circumstance where that can be the case. Now, this Conservative government is now taxing business more than it's been taxed in a long time. It's created huge amounts of problems at our border with trade by botching the Brexit deal. Of course, they are looking to see what Labour offers, which is why Keir's speech is important. And after Boris Johnson's performance this morning, that embarrassing performance where he compared himself to Moses and actually talked about Pepper the Pig a lot, I think that, of course, they're going to look to see if there's something serious on offer, and I know that there will be.
Right, well, sticking with Labour, since that's on the front page of City AM, and as Andy Sylvester said, Labour is very much making its pitch to business, is an admission, isn't it, of some of what Gitto was saying. It's a break with the Jeremy Corbyn era and that lack of a relationship with business, and trying to sort of leave that behind.
Yeah, it's very important that we work together with business, that we have a government that knows at the time now we are having to re-engineer our entire economy to deal with the threat of climate change. Because we've come out of the European Union, we've got to completely remake our relations with the rest of the world for trade purposes. We've got to do a lot more helping business to survive in a very rapidly changing environment, and the government can play a very positive role in doing that. I don't think this government is.
Right, we'll come on to that in a moment. Chris, a lot of us, when we talk about business, we are usually talking about big business. What about the view of small businesses and what might need to be done to make them feel more loved?
Well, I think it's a classic kind of Blairite thing. Parties are broad coalitions, and so it's quite right that Keir Starmer should reach out like this. And I think it's very interesting that they're going for the business rates reform as well, which is a real thing for small businesses, particularly for high street businesses. And it's just a replacement of Labour. I think I'm up here in the northeast, and the perception of Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party was that it was very 1970s Islington. And Keir Starmer is kind of at least dragging Labour into the 21st century, but it still feels very geographically distant.
Right. I mean, Siobhan, you can hardly blame business for feeling unloved, certainly by Boris Johnson, when, as we have heard, he said F business won't provide enough visas to solve labour shortages, as Andy Sylvester was saying, and business has been surprised. You know, what's going on?
Well, I mean, I think government has been using quite a few of the levers available to them. I mean, you heard exactly what City AM was saying about the work over the pandemic, and a lot of my SMEs in Stroud still say thank you for the furlough schemes and thank you for the grants. But you know, we are very close to the Labour leadership at the moment. We're trying to get Jeremy Corbyn into power. We know he would have bust the economy a few times over, and we also know Labour is not trusted on the economy. And I think what we're looking with the Chancellor and the Prime Minister in partnership, plan for jobs, growth up. We've got a huge amount of vacancies in place. You know, we've got a jobs boom at the moment. But wages
okay,
rising.
fine. Well, obviously, you respond first.
Growth is up because growth went down by 25% during the lockdowns last year. So we're not going to get back to levels of growth until next year because of the pandemic. So that's a false...
Well, there are high levels of growth and then it sort of tails off, is the prediction.
Because it plummeted and now it's coming back up. But the issue that we've got to answer is how do we help our economy change and develop in these very difficult times with climate change and the move to net zero, with dealing with Brexit and the problems at our economy, with our trade plummeting, with having rows with our European partners. We've got to help business deal with that.
On the economy. They know that we have had a very, very difficult...
But don't say that growth is rising when it's just returning from the plummet.
Ultimately, this country has got to recover. At the point where the country has recovered, the public know that it's the Conservatives that will cut the taxes, and if Labour are in power, they
you would say that, and that is but that's a huge assumption.
To the highest levels they've been since the 1950s.
All right, well, moving away from trust, let's look at some of the specifics, like visas. You know, the lack of HGV drivers, the government issued 5,000 visas when the shortfall was estimated to be 100,000. You know, we've also seen a shortage of poultry workers and a lack of staff for abattoirs, leading to pigs being culled unnecessarily on welfare grounds. Your party is refusing to give business what it wants. Why?
They did, but that's not true. I mean, you know that a lot of those numbers are disputed, for example, with the HGV licences. And when the visas were released, you know, we're in the middle of a global problem. So it wasn't hugely surprising when a lot of people didn't take up the visas. But ultimately,
there are no
we have
drivers
got to,
for the gritters.
Let her finish and I'll come back to you.
We've got to get to the point where we're increasing wages and we're not reliant on cheap labour from overseas. And, you know, we're in a transition period of that, and government is pulling the levers available to them, and they are few. It shouldn't always be about government. Making the government bigger.
Right. Do you want to? Would you like to see 100,000 on this specific? Because people understand the issue here. Shortages of HGV drivers. You can dispute the figures, but Keir Starmer suggested up to 100,000 visas were needed. Would you support that?
5,000 isn't enough. So
Right.
you've got to make sure that you can train your own. I mean, at the moment, we're told that there aren't enough people to drive.
So would you go for 100,000?
The gritter trucks, which will actually make our roads safe if we have a freeze. Now, what sort of a government doesn't provide those basics? This government don't even do the basics to ensure that our society runs.
Right.
So one of the issues I've spotted is the DVLA has simply gone into permanent lockdown, certainly did for a big chunk of the last 18 months, and is literally not issuing licences for people to even train for the jobs. So to suddenly turn that into a debate about whether we have enough migration into this country is missing the point that on our own doorstep, the lockdown that people like you still advocate being done in a more aggressive manner has given the justification for licences not being issued, not being renewed, tests not being run, and pay presto, we have a shortage.
I have not been advocating a lockdown. The fact is the DVLA is a government agency, and if the Department of Transport can't get the DVLA to run properly so that they actually issue us with the licences that we need, then that's a government delivery problem.
And they should definitely get onto that, because that is responsible for a big chunk of this, and it's barely talked about.
Right, but there is, it's an example of a quandary, isn't it, Angela, that perhaps both Labour and the Conservatives are facing, that business is calling for certain things that aren't necessarily popular with the electorate. And this issue of more immigration, whether it's temporary or not, to cope with labour shortages, because you're at risk of issuing, let's say, up to 100,000 visas, could look like a return to some sort of free movement. I mean, do you accept that that is a difficulty in terms of presenting it politically?
Of course it's a difficulty, and coming out of the European Union and moving away from a single market is going to create disjunctions, but it doesn't seem that this government has planned for any of them. It's not planned for any of them. It's not ensured that there's training available so that people here can be trained. It just presides over incompetence and failure to deliver.
Right. I mean, there is an issue, isn't there, with the transition that you talked about. If Boris Johnson wants to move to a high-wage, high-skilled economy, it's a huge gamble.
Well, I mean, we all know from speaking to businesses and people across our constituencies that there are recruitment drives going on. We're looking at, I mean, it's not true to say the training isn't happening. We've got an amazing amount of skills, kickstart packages, apprentices, 100,000 apprentices. We've got skills camps and all sorts. We've got a brand new skills piece of legislation going through the House of Commons. All the focus is on making people get into work and learn through their lifetime and make sure that we are completely working hand in hand with businesses. And you know, and I think that it's going to be a tough few months. We all knew that with
more than a
winter
few
anyway.
months.
Well, no, I actually think, you know, we've got everybody focused now on really delivering for the country, and I think businesses are working hand in hand with those skills and learning.
Chris, final word before we move on.
Well, I think Brexit has played a real part in this, and we're talking about migration. It's strange that we haven't really had a policy or have any understanding of how you can shut off uncontrolled immigration and then not find employees and workers at home. We just didn't see that one coming, did we?
Right, we'll leave it there. I think everyone will broadly agree that Boris Johnson has probably had one of the most challenging few weeks of his premiership. Self-inflicted wound over Owen Paterson's lobbying, disquiet, as we've been discussing, over social care changes, broken promises on railways and HS2 last week. Let me just show you this YouGov Best Prime Minister tracker, not voting intention. You can see there the crossover just recently with Keir Starmer, people think, as a better Prime Minister for the first time since certainly early this year. Gitto used to work for Boris Johnson. For a while, it has seemed as if he could sort of defy gravity, sort of Teflon Prime Minister. It now looks as if that has changed. Can he come back from this?
Well, it's not over, is it? He's still sitting in Parliament with an 80-seat majority, a refreshed cabinet and a budget that landed pretty well, and he's just hosted a global summit. So just for perspective, it's not exactly like that. Also, you and I, actually you're much younger than me, but I remember when John Major presided over a period of real Tory sleaze, and literally you woke up every day to fresh evidence of a new person who had done something that you could explain in the pub quite easily what was shocking about it. It was usually sexual or so blatantly financial that it was sensational. We are not remotely in that period at the moment. Has Boris had a bad few weeks? Yes, of course he has. Is some of it his own making? Yes. He's a man who goes more than anyone else in politics on instinct. He writes his own speeches, which very few politicians do. He has a gut about things, and sometimes that gut doesn't take him to the right place. Sometimes he takes a gut instinct response to something that needs looking at in great detail. And that clearly happened with Owen Paterson.
Right. I mean, you mentioned, and Angela obviously mentioned the speech today. Do you think that some people would regard it as too jokey, too clowny? The conference speech too, does that need to change?
Do you know what? I worked for Boris Johnson when he was trying to pose a change in the benefits cap in London. It was so technical, so nerdy, that unless it affected you, at which point it was critical, it was boring for other people. And he didn't sort of get into the nerdy detail. He said to David Cameron, a Tory Prime Minister at the time, no Kosovo-style social cleansing on my watch. And do you know what happened? The changes that would have cut the housing benefit of poor people in London got shelved because of that effective use of language. Language is there to communicate not with the Governor of the Bank of England and with each other in the studio, but with people out there who are not going to sit through a whole CBI speech, but will clock something that all their kids are watching if it's Peppa Pig, or will clock, you know, other sort of references that brings that speech alive to them.
Right. I mean, do you think, Angela, it would be wrong to count him out at this point, Boris Johnson, even if there is a slight uptick in terms of Keir Starmer's popularity?
I don't believe in ever being so complacent that you would count somebody out when they've got an 80 majority in Parliament. Getting the government to change is hard, tough work, and you have to keep going to make a positive case, but also point out that there's a lot of sleaze around at the moment. What the Prime Minister tried to do, overthrowing the standards process completely to save one of his mates who'd made over £500,000 in a way which the Commissioner found was an egregious breach of rules that have been very well known in Parliament against paid lobbying, was outrageous. And then what's been going on with the contracts for coronavirus testing and some of the
although you have been making something
of
that for many, many months, and it didn't seem to be having an impact.
Well, I think it is having an impact now. I think there's a very great deal of worry and outrage about over £2.5 billion of public money being given to companies which are Conservative donors without competition. We've got the story in the Times today about Tory MPs in the main and their second jobs. The public don't like this. They don't want to think that MPs are making that much amount of money on the side.
Is Angela right, Gitto, that this stuff is beginning to have traction, even if it didn't before?
Yes, it's very, very toxic, and it will stick in the end. And it's probably the single biggest danger for Boris Johnson and his government in terms of longevity. So he needs to sort of be very, very sure-footed and very, very loud about this. But also, I think we need more honesty in the debate. We talk about MPs on the make as if they were all sort of smashing it financially. The reality is that we don't mind footballers being paid 100 grand a week for kicking a ball around, representing a club or country, but somehow we think that people should go into politics to represent us and not earn remotely that amount of money annually. We've got to be honest about funding politics properly so we attract the right people into politics so they don't need to do things on the side.
Nobody needs to do things on the side. It's a positive choice to decide that you're going to make more than your salary in side hustles. Remember that MPs' pay is already in the top 10%.
And we have talked about this, but actually, Siobhan, I will let you come back more broadly. But back in July, I was interested, you rated Boris Johnson 10 out of 10, said you had complete faith in his leadership. Do you still feel that way?
Listen, I just want to come back on what Angela said. I wouldn't be sat here twitching, listening to Angela and telling Guito off if it wasn't for the fact that we've got loads of Labour MPs with second jobs and the leadership earning 25 grand extra and Dave Lamb, but ultimately I think that the throwing the mud around will just poison the well for all politicians. It's already difficult enough to get people to want to stand and get involved in this game. But ultimately, most MPs are in that place working 7 days a week and working really hard to deliver for their constituency. And it was the Prime Minister that has brought a set of proposals to the Speaker in the last week.
Let's not go back over how that evolved. But on 10 out of 10, do you still stick by that grading for Boris Johnson?
For the Prime Minister to do well means the country is doing well. We all want the Prime Minister to be doing 10 out of 10 and making sure that the leadership...
Is he still doing 10 out of 10?
I think the Prime Minister has admitted he had a difficult run and there should never have been a conflation between an individual
you would knock off a couple of marks off that score? What would you have to do? What would you have to do to get a lower score from you?
We've got to be... I quit my PPS role, actually, but we've got to want the Prime Minister of this country to do well and get on with his job without this constant mudslinging.
All right. In the end, you don't need to score 10 out of 10 in every essay to get a first in your degree at the end of those. So what matters in the end is where he and every other politician is by the time they next face the electorate.
All right.
There will be weeks when they score badly on all sides.
Chris, what grading would you give, or your readers give, Boris Johnson, particularly following the announcement on the railways?
Well, there was profound dischuffment over the rail up here, and really deep stuff. If you go down into Yorkshire, where my colleagues on newspapers are using words like betrayal and lies on the line. But in this area, which is a little bit north of Yorkshire in County Durham, which fell for the red wall, fell for Boris Johnson, it really was Boris Johnson that won in December 2019 in these seats up here. They didn't fall for David Cameron. They didn't like Theresa May. They didn't like austerity. And it is Boris Johnson who delivered those. And I can't see another Conservative politician who will reach out in the same way as Boris Johnson. I was up in Hartlepool during the general by-election just a few months ago, and people were cheering him. Even whilst he was speaking, they were kind of applauding him. So it's a really strange phenomenon, but where he can appeal to these traditional Labour areas. And it's almost as if they're two Conservative parties in one, because there is a very different feel down south, I think, about it.
We've only got a few minutes left, but I just want to show you the headline here on Boris Johnson being exasperated and has ordered a review into Channel small boat crossings. We've done an awful lot on the programme about the numbers of migrants, asylum seekers coming across the Channel in those small boats. Is this going to be the defining issue, or a defining issue for the government, Guito? I
find that hard to believe in the end, that people care about this more than they care about jobs and opportunities and the NHS and schools and hospitals and all of that. It's a very powerful thing in certain communities, and it resonates very loudly on the Conservative backbenches, no doubt about that. But I don't think that will decide the next election.
Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I was out canvassing on the doorsteps on Saturday. It didn't come up once with me. I do get emails on the issue. I think it would be a mistake for any government to ignore the issue of migration, but yeah, it's not something that's coming up.
And Chris, what about your readers? Are they concerned about this issue? Is it defining?
I think it is an important issue. My MPs tell me they get loads of emails about it, and it is part of the Brexit legacy about taking control of borders, and yet demonstrably that's not happening, and so it plays into the competence of the government. It's quite strange that even up this far away from the English Channel, it should have resonance.
Right, Chris, well, thank you for that, and dischuffment. Defining issue, yes or no?
Well, it's another broken promise, which is proof of the incompetence of this government.
Oh, well, on that note, thank you to all of my guests today for our Monday programme. I will be back tomorrow at 6:15 with more Politics Live. From all of us here, bye-bye.